How should international society respond to governments committing atrocities and genocide against their own population? Let's explore. One of the most challenging questions in international relations is the issue of genocide. And the issue becomes much more complicated if governments commit genocide or atrocities against their own citizens. Now, this is where the question arises, what should international society do? Now, the problem here gets difficult. Why? Because today nations are built around this principle of sovereignty. So every sovereign nation has a right to run their own affairs. So suppose in a country A, there's a political regime which is committing atrocities, which is committing genocide against own civilians. What should international community do? Should the international community respect sovereignty of the country and stay away? Or should they try to intervene and stop that massacre? What should the international community do? It's one of the biggest questions. And the question became all the more tricky after Second World War. After Second World War, there was a kind of a common consensus. This country should respect human rights. Countries should respect human dignity. Now, on one side, sovereignty is also important. On the other side, human rights becomes very important. So just imagine the dilemma. A country is committing atrocities, violating human rights of their own citizens. What should the international community do? Don't you think it's a tough question to unravel? And today that's what we'll be discussing. Should countries intervene forcefully? What are the arguments that support humanitarian intervention? And what are the arguments against humanitarian intervention? That's what we'll explore today. Armed humanitarian intervention was not the norm during Cold War times, because those times sovereignty was given more importance than the question of human rights. It was only from the 1990s onwards that international community started giving a lot of importance to human rights. This shift in attitude during 1990s was reflected best in UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's speech. There was a developing international norm to forcibly protect civilians who were at the risk from genocide and mass killing. It was not until 2011, when the humanitarian crisis in Libya deepened, when UN Assembly adopted a resolution allowing forcible intervention in a fully functioning sovereign state. Now, that was a landmark event. Let's leave the chronology, the history, and the beginnings of humanitarian intervention aside. Let's come to the core issue or the core topic of today's session. I'm here to explore arguments for and against humanitarian intervention. My biggest question is, should countries get involved in other countries' affairs? That's a question we'll explore. So let me start with case for humanitarian intervention. What are the arguments we have in support of humanitarian intervention? The first justification I have is legal arguments. And the first legal argument is the UN Charter 1945 commits states to protecting fundamental human rights. The argument here is that human rights are just as important as peace and security in the UN Charter. The Charter's preamble and articles all highlighted the importance of human rights, and Article 1, Clause 3 identifies the protection of human rights as one of the principal purposes of human system. Legally speaking, UN Charter of 1945 was a very interesting document. Why? Because it placed human rights on the same pedestal as peace and security. Interesting. Now, keeping up with the legal arguments, some more legal scholars pointed out that even before 1945 UN Charter, countries customarily had this habit of intervening in humanitarian crises. For example, Britain, France, and Russia intervened in Greece. US intervened in Cuba. So humanitarian intervention is not anything new. This was always there. Let's leave the legal arguments aside. Let's look at the ethical justifications. A lot of philosophers point out that in a situation of genocide and mass killings, it's a moral duty of international society to intervene because it's a human being that's in distress. Now, what these philosophers point out is if a state, if a sovereign state cannot guarantee and protect its own citizens, it loses its right to govern. It loses its ethical right to govern over its citizens. So once a state loses its ethical rights over its own citizens, what's wrong in intervening? Along with moral duty, some philosophers also emphasize on this term called common humanity. So when humanity is suffering, it's a responsibility of other countries to help them out, to intervene, to rescue them, to protect them, to ensure that human rights are respected. Besides the philosophers, some world leaders emphasize that today in a globalized world, threat to human rights in one country is a major threat to world peace. So in the interest of world peace, in the interest of world security, there's no harm in intervening in other countries' affairs as long as the intervention ensures world peace. Brian D. Lepard's book points out there is an agreement among religions and major ethical systems about our duty, about our moral duty to prevent mass killings. And the duty has to be taken up seriously. We explore legal and moral justification for humanitarian intervention. Let's look at the other side. Let's look at why humanitarian intervention cannot be justified legally and morally. A lot of legal scholars point out that there is no provision in international law supporting humanitarian intervention. Let's explore this. Some scholars maintain that the common good is best preserved by maintaining a ban on any use of force not authorized by the UN Security Council. They also point to the fact that when states have acted unilaterally, they have chosen not to articulate a general legal right of humanitarian intervention. Interveners have typically claimed to be acting in self-defense, for example, Vietnam's 1978 intervention in Cambodia. Second point that a lot of critics point out is states don't have a habit of intervening for humanitarian reasons. States prefer to intervene only selectively when it suits their interest. Now, these people have a big question. Why should a state sacrifice, or why should a country sacrifice their soldiers to help a third person? How can you justify sacrificing your soldiers to your own country people? French intervention in Rwanda in 1994. France supposedly said they're intervening in the name of humanitarian reasons. But everybody knew that France was doing it to promote their own self-interest. Because France had a very strong presence in Rwanda because it propped up the Hutu regime for almost 20 years. So France was doing it for their own interest. The next argument is a very interesting question. And I'll raise the question to all of you, and do share your thoughts. Do you think it's morally justified for a country to send its soldiers abroad and sacrifice their lives in the name of protecting genocide from happening in a third country? You think it's morally justified? For example, just imagine Indian soldiers going abroad to protect third country civilians against human rights violations and coming back in body bags. Is it ethically justified? Think about it. This is a key argument that a lot of leaders and scholars use against humanitarian intervention. Speaking of body bags, a fine example comes to my mind. In 1992, Somalia, sentiments of compassion pushed UN citizens to push their leadership to intervene. And US intervened. But slowly what happened, the intervention didn't go too great. US soldiers started returning in body bags. And the moment the citizens of US saw their own soldiers coming back in body bags, the whole sentiment of compassion vanished. People started raising questions. about sacrificing their soldiers to protect somebody in a third country. Interestingly, Samuel Huntington writes this. It is morally unjustifiable and politically indefensible that members of US armed forces should be killed to prevent Somalis from killing one another. Another key argument scholars make is, in the absence of any mechanism to oversee humanitarian intervention, any impartial mechanism to oversee humanitarian intervention, usually humanitarian interventions end up serving national interest. Some scholars point out that humanitarian interventions don't work in the long run. For example, country A intervenes in the affairs of country C to protect human rights in country C. And once intervention becomes successful, once things are stable, country A leaves country C. And once it comes back, now country C, it's on its own. Now they have to fend for themselves. Now this is the time things become ugly. Why? Because the people of country C are used being protected by a third party. Now they have lost this whole thing of fighting for themselves. To conclude, let me give you a recap of the arguments. Humanitarian intervention can be justified because it respects the inviolate and universal nature of human rights. That's the first argument. Second, it takes duties of global justice seriously. Thirdly, it respects all human beings and not citizens. Humanitarian intervention is not justified because, firstly, the humanitarian claim might be abused. In the name of humanitarian, countries usually use it to mask their self-interest. Secondly, it's difficult to publicly justify casualties to defend strangers. Body bag factor. I'll close today's session with a small question. And the question is, how far do you think it's justified to use military force in the name of humanitarian values? Do share your thoughts in the comment section. Looking forward to read your comments. Happy learning. See you soon.